Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a question that I think a lot of people have probably thought about, but maybe haven't really explored in depth.
Oh, yeah.
Does living together before marriage still carry a stigma in like 2024? I mean, come on.
Right.
And what's really interesting is we're actually dissecting source material from a proposed podcast episode
Really fun.
called Living Together Without the Ring. Is there still a stigma around cohabitation? So kind of a meta deep dive here.
Very meta.
We get to peek behind the curtain of how another podcast is made, but also really get into the meat of this question.
Yeah, it's funny because when you first said that question, it's like, on the surface, it's like, oh yeah, does it? But then the more you think about it, it's like, well, wait a minute, there's actually a lot to unpack there.
So much.
Because, yeah, it's like so common now. But attitudes are kind of all over the place. We're talking generational divides, different religious beliefs, and even like those unspoken societal pressures that can really make you question what you thought you believed.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yes. And honestly, I've lived with partners before getting married, and I can tell you those pressures are real.
Oh, yeah.
Like they get in your head.
For sure.
So let's get into it. The proposed podcast actually defines cohabitation as a romantic relationship where a couple lives together without being married.
Yeah.
Seems pretty straightforward.
Right.
But why is that distinction even important anymore?
Well, because marriage, for all its modern variations, it still has this like weight of legal and social expectation that just doesn't exist with cohabitation. It's a contract, it's a public declaration, and for a lot of people it's still tied to this idea of like stability and commitment that living together even for years may not automatically convey.
So it's not just about sharing a roof and, splitting bills. It's about how the world sees your relationship. And historically speaking, cohabitation was definitely not the popular choice.
Oh, absolutely. Especially like in religious communities or for older generations, there's this deeply ingrained sense that marriage is the right path, the marker of true adulthood. Anything else was seen as kind of risky, less committed, maybe even morally questionable.
But things have changed a lot, right?
Yeah.
Like even the proposed podcast acknowledges that cohabitation has become way more common. Like what's driving that shift?
It's a few things, actually.
Yeah.
We're seeing less people getting married. Overall, people are delaying marriage longer if they do get married. And we're just seeing more and more people opting out of marriage entirely. Younger generations especially seem to be less attached to that idea that marriage is the only way to show that you're in a serious relationship.
It's like they're saying, hey, we can build a life together. We can make big decisions together without needing that piece of paper.
Right, exactly. And let's not forget the practical side of things. In this economy, sharing living expenses just makes sense for a lot of couples. It helps them reach financial goals faster, whether that's saving for a house or traveling, or honestly just making ends meet.
So it's this mix of changing social norms, financial practicality, and a generation that's basically redefining what commitment even means. But here's the big question. Is there actually still a stigma? I mean, even if your grandma raises an eyebrow, does it really affect people's lives?
That's where things get really psychologically interesting. Because even if you personally don't care about that stigma, society's expectations are kind of sneaky. They creep into your subconscious and they make you question your choices, and they can even like spark arguments with your partner.
Wait, so you're saying even if you think you're super progressive, like you're beyond all that, you could still be carrying around this baggage?
Oh, absolutely. The proposed podcast doesn't really dive too deep into this, but research shows that internalized stigma is a real thing. Couples might start to feel like they need to overcompensate or prove their commitment in ways that married couples don't even think about, or they might feel ashamed even though logically they know that their relationship is valid.
So it's not just about being judged by other people. It's about how that judgment gets in your head and messes with your own self-worth.
Exactly. And that's why this deep dive is so important, because understanding how this stigma works, both on a societal level and a personal level, can help us make better choices in our relationships. Choices without unnecessary guilt or pressure or this feeling that we have to prove anything to anyone but ourselves and our partner.
Okay, so we've established that cohabitation is on the rise. But the traditional views of marriage, they haven't vanished overnight. And even those of us who think we're totally past all of that might be surprised by how those pressures can sneak in. This is way more complicated than I thought.
What's interesting is that even within the stigma, there's all these layers. The proposed podcast focuses a lot on the generational differences, but there's also religion, there's cultural background and individual personalities. You might have a family that's very liberal, but then they're weirdly judgmental about you not being married.
It's like this whole tangled web of influences. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. We've laid the groundwork. We know this isn't a simple live together or get married situation. And we've hinted at how this can impact people psychologically, even folks who consider themselves progressive.
Right. And in the next part, we're going to get into the actual consequences. Because, societal judgment, it's not just about awkward Thanksgiving dinners. It can have a serious impact on a couple's emotional well-being, their sense of security in the relationship, even their long-term goals.
Oh boy, this is getting heavy.
Yeah.
Make sure you guys are hydrated, emotionally prepared, maybe have some tissues handy, because this deep dive is about to get real. Welcome back to our deep dive into cohabitation. And honestly, the more we talk about it, the more I'm realizing this stigma is like way more of a thing than I even realized. Like last time we were talking about how those societal expectations around marriage, they can really mess with your head, even if you think you're like super progressive.
It's so true. It's like we're all products of our environment, right? So even if you intellectually disagree with this idea that marriage is the only way to validate a relationship, those years of hearing like, when are you getting married, or only seeing certain types of couples celebrated, it leaves a mark.
Totally. So let's get into like the actual consequences of this stigma, because it's not just about feeling a little weird at Thanksgiving dinner. Our source material mentions increased stress and even like doubts within the relationship. Is that like a real thing?
Oh, absolutely. Like imagine you and your partner are super committed, but you're constantly getting hit with questions like, so when's the real wedding? Or jokes about how you're just playing house. Like over time, that chips away at your sense of legitimacy, even if you try to brush it off.
It's like constantly being compared to this gold standard that honestly not everyone wants or needs. And that comparison can create so much insecurity, right? Like, am I not good enough because we haven't done things that way?
Exactly. And it can lead to these internal debates within the couple, too. One partner might start feeling pressure to get married, not because they want to, but to appease family or prove something to society. And the other partner might resent that pressure and feel like their commitment is being questioned.
Ugh. So what starts as this external judgment like seeps into the dynamic between the couple? Not exactly a recipe for relationship bliss.
And it goes even deeper than that. Studies have shown that cohabiting couples, especially women, often have higher levels of anxiety and depression compared to married couples. Now, obviously, there are a lot of factors at play there, but that societal stigma and that feeling of being less than, they definitely contribute.
Wow. Okay, so this is not just about hurt feelings. We're talking potential mental health impacts. And I imagine this could affect even like practical stuff like career choices or financial planning.
Absolutely. Like imagine you get a job offer in a new city, but your partner is hesitant to move because they know their family will judge them even harder for living together unmarried in a new place. Or you put off buying a house together because subconsciously you feel less secure in the relationship without that marriage certificate.
It's like there's this invisible hand pushing you towards certain decisions, even if you don't realize it's happening.
Yeah.
And that can breed so much resentment or this feeling of being trapped or making choices that aren't really aligned with your goals as a couple.
Right. And this is where I think that generational divide we talked about earlier becomes really interesting. The proposed podcast talks about how younger people are kind of leading this shift away from marriage being the only way to show you're committed. But older generations still hold a lot of power, especially within families.
So you're stuck between what you believe and what your loved ones expect.
Yeah.
How do you even begin to reconcile that?
Communication is key, but it's tough. It's not just about telling grandma to back off. It's about trying to understand why those beliefs are so important to her, and then being able to clearly articulate your own values, even if it leads to uncomfortable conversations.
It sounds like such a balancing act, like honoring your own choices while also navigating these relationships with people who might not get it. And it probably requires setting some serious boundaries, right?
Yeah,
Like, we love you, but this is our decision, and we need you to respect that even if you don't agree.
exactly. And sometimes those boundaries mean limiting contact with people who are constantly being disrespectful or judgmental, even if it's family. It's about putting your own mental well-being and the health of your relationship above conforming to expectations that don't serve you.
Man, that takes courage,
Yeah.
especially when you're up against these really ingrained societal norms. And it makes you realize this isn't just about individual couples. This is about a larger cultural shift that's still in progress.
What's fascinating is that research has actually shown that even within families, the more exposure people have to cohabiting couples who are happy and successful, the more their attitudes soften over time.
So visibility matters.
Yeah.
The more we normalize healthy cohabiting relationships,
Yeah.
the less power that stigma has.
Exactly. And that's where personal stories are so important. Sharing those experiences, both the good and the bad, helps break down stereotypes and lets people see cohabitation not as this scary, rebellious thing, but as a legitimate choice that works for a lot of people.
This is reminding me of like the early LGBTQ plus rights movements, where just being visible and sharing personal stories help change public perception.
Yeah.
It's about humanizing the issue, showing that these aren't just abstract concepts. These are real people's lives.
You're so right. It's about breaking down that us versus them mentality and fostering empathy and understanding. But let's be real, this isn't a quick fix.
Okay, so we've explored some pretty heavy consequences here. Mental health impacts, relationship strain, even affecting major life decisions. It feels like there's this huge weight on couples to not only make their relationship work, but also to somehow change the world's mind about cohabitation.
And that's where things get really tricky, because while societal change is super important, you can't put that burden solely on individual couples. They need tools to navigate this world right now. And that's what we're going to explore in the next part. Practical strategies for cohabiting couples to build resilience, communicate effectively, and find happiness on their own terms, regardless of external pressure.
Whew, I need a break after all that. Listeners, grab yourself a snack, take a walk, do whatever you need to process this. Because when we come back, we're getting into the good stuff. Not just surviving this stigma, but thriving despite it. All right, guys, welcome back to the deep dive. I'm not going to lie, after that last part, I think I need a hug and maybe a therapist.
It can get pretty heavy.
It's a lot. We're really getting into those consequences of the cohabitation stigma, like the mental health impacts, the strain it can put on relationships, even how it affects like big life decisions.
Yeah.
It's a lot to process.
It is. It's true that the weight of those societal expectations can feel really, really heavy, even when you're trying so hard to do your own thing. But the good news is this deep dive isn't about doom and gloom.
Right.
It's about empowerment.
Okay, so less focusing on the problem, more solutions. I love that our source material kind of skims over this. But I'm guessing communication is super key here.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you and your partner are on the same page, that's got to count for something.
Absolutely. And it's not even just about like agreeing on whether or not to get married eventually. It's about being honest about your own individual anxieties, about how those external pressures are actually affecting you, and talking about what kind of support you need from each other.
So it's like, hey, honey, I know we both think Aunt Mildred's judgment is ridiculous, but it actually makes me feel insert vulnerable emotion here, which honestly can be a hard conversation to have.
It is. It really is. But creating that safe space where you can both be vulnerable with each other without judgment, it's so crucial. It strengthens your bond, and it helps you present a united front to the outside world.
Okay, so you're emotionally in sync, which is great. But what about those like practical challenges we talked about? Like, what do you do when grandma keeps asking about wedding plans, or you get that look from your coworker like they're concerned?
Boundaries, my friend. Boundaries. That's the key. And this is where couples really need to work together. It's about deciding what you're comfortable sharing, what questions are totally off limits, and how you're going to respond to people who just don't get it.
So it's less about convincing everyone that you're right and more about protecting your own peace of mind.
Yeah.
Exactly. I love that. But let's be real. Setting boundaries with family, especially older generations, can feel so confrontational.
Oh, it definitely can be. It's a skill. It takes practice. But there are so many resources out there, books, articles, therapists who specialize in helping people navigate those tricky family dynamics. Because you deserve to have your choices respected, even if they don't fit the mold.
And I'm guessing the whole find your tribe thing is important too, right?
Yeah.
Surrounding yourself with people who get it, who don't make you feel like you have to constantly explain or defend your choices.
100%. Because when you're surrounded by negativity or judgment all the time, it's easy to start questioning everything. Having a supportive community, whether it's friends or other couples who are cohabiting, or even like online groups, it really helps you stay grounded and remember that you're not alone.
It's like that saying, you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with.
Yeah.
So if those people are constantly reinforcing that your relationship is valid and awesome, that's going to have a positive impact for sure.
Absolutely. And that's actually where I think this proposed podcast misses a big opportunity. You know, they talk about the stigma, which is important. But what about celebrating the joys and the strengths of cohabiting relationships?
Yes.
There's so much focus on what's wrong and what society disapproves of that we forget to highlight all the things that are great about this choice.
Okay, preach. I've lived both ways. And honestly, there's a freedom and a level of intentional commitment that comes with choosing to build a life with someone without all the legal and societal pressures of marriage.
It's so true. Cohabiting couples often develop incredible communication skills, a really deep sense of partnership, and this amazing ability to create their own rule book for what works for them.
Yeah, it's like they're pioneers,
They are,
forging a new path and proving that commitment and happiness can exist in all these different forms.
100%. And I think that's the message we need to be shouting from the rooftops. Yes, the stigma exists. Yes, it can be challenging. But cohabitation can also be this incredibly fulfilling and empowering experience. It's about choosing love and partnership and shared values on your own terms and building a life that feels authentic and joyful, regardless of what anyone else thinks.
Mic drop moment right there. So, to our listener out there who's navigating this world of cohabitation, you are not alone. Your relationship is valid. And while the journey might have its bumps, it can also be incredibly beautiful and rewarding.
Don't forget you have the power to define your own version of commitment and happiness. Don't let those societal pressures dictate your choices or dim your shine. Build a life that feels true to you. Surround yourself with supportive people and celebrate every win along the way.
And that, my friends, is a wrap on this deep dive. We hope you learned something, laughed a little, and maybe even felt a little less alone in your own journey. Until next time, keep diving deep, keep questioning, and keep choosing love in whatever form it takes for you.